After much criticism, the beer store has offered small brewers a piece of the pie, presumably in hopes that it will be enough to curry favor with the public and Queen's Park. Joining us now with his view on the offer, here's Regg, political columnist for the Toronto Star at Queen's Park. Martin, as always, good to have you back here.
Thank you.
At TVO. Can we just start again with some background? I know we do this in the past, but every time I see people do man-on-the-street interviews on TV, they all think the government owns the beer store. So we need to clarify, who owns the beer store?
The government of Ontario. No, I'm just kidding.
It's not the government, Martin. The LCBO is owned by the government.
But you can't blame people for thinking that because it looks like a government-owned operation. It acts like a government-owned operation. And it's built like a government-owned operation. But it is owned by the private sector. There's a reason for that. Historically, going back about 90 years, the brewers were asked by the government to have a warehousing operation and a retail operation. It all got consolidated over the decades. It was a Canadian-owned, privately run beer operation. But then, and thanks to globalization in the last few years, you now have three owners: Labatt, which is owned by AB InBev of Belgium. You have Molson Coors, which is owned by Molson Coors as a merged entity, which has its head offices in Colorado. And there's an office in Montreal as well. And you have Sleeman, which is owned by Sapporo of Japan. So the entire ownership, pretty much, of the beer store is foreign, private and overseas or abroad.
And here, I would say, probably thanks in large measure to a lot of the reporting and being a pain in the neck that you've been on this story, here are some of the changes that the beer store has on offer. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up this graphic. Smaller brewers will now have the option to buy a share for $100, while larger brewers will pay $1,000 per share. That's to get a seat at the table. Brewers will also get to list 2 of their products for free at the 5 locations nearest to their brewery. They will also receive a reduced listing fee in the beer store system, and smaller brewers will also control 3 of the 15 seats on the beer store's board of directors. How meaningful do you think any of that is?
Not very meaningful in substance, not even in image. I think it's too little, too late. If the beer store had come up with this about a year and a half or 2 years ago, when the craft brewers were begging them to have a dialogue, it might have gone some way towards bringing some peace. I think bringing it in now is really a Hail Mary pass. They're using the craft brewers as a kind of political cover to camouflage their foreign ownership and the fact that it's dominated by 3 big foreign brewers. And the craft brewers are not really prepared to play ball. But number 2, this doesn't really help the consumer. This is trying to appease craft brewers, who are an important and growing segment of the market, an Ontario segment of the market, Ontario jobs and Ontario products. But what's missing in this equation is the beer drinker and the taxpayer as well. This isn't just about beer drinkers. It's not about corner stores. It's not about supermarkets in the private sector. It's about the people of Ontario who don't have a stake in this.
Let's pick that apart. How is the beer drinker absent from this equation?
Well, the latest proposal is trying to give the craft brewers a minority, a minority stake in the beer store by nibbling around at the edges. It's not going to help the beer drinker because the beer store is broken. It's an outdated and ossified retail experience. I think people in this province understand that. That's why they sometimes think it's a government-owned operation. Just contrast that with the LCBO, which is government-owned and which has improved, which has kept up with the times. Some people don't like the LCBO, but there's not a clamor to get rid of the LCBO. It has its fans, its people who appreciate what it does. The beer store is just like it's back in the 1950s.
Well, one of the reasons that the government of Ontario, and some Ontario taxpayers, I guess, like the LCBO, is that they, in doing what they do, remit almost $2 billion a year to the Treasury of Ontario. Does the beer store remit anything to the Treasury as well?
Well, the beer store remits taxes, like any enterprise, just like small convenience stores remit cigarette taxes to the government. So that's not out of the generosity of the beer store and its owners, the 3 big brewers. The LCBO, you're quite right, delivers a significant amount of revenue, profit from their retail operation, which is a monopoly in wine and spirits, and has a monopoly power which the government benefits from. Monopolies are not perfect, they're not always good, they're not the ideal economic model, but a monopoly does have the benefit of giving you a big whack of profit. And if it goes to the government to pay for hospitals, schools, police forces, roads, that's not a bad thing. That's nothing to sneeze at. With the beer store, it's flowing out of the country. And that's what Ed Clark, who is the former TD Bank CEO, who was brought in by the government to look at these public enterprises, that's what he's looking at is, hey, why is this enormously profitable enterprise, which is more profitable in Ontario than anywhere else in Canada and much of the Western world, why are they keeping this big whack of profit? Doesn't make sense.
I was going to get to this later, but since you've raised it, there does seem to be a discrepancy over whether the monopoly that the three big brewers have in selling their wares is worth anything. They have said it isn't. Ed Clark has said it is. Who's right?
Well, it absolutely is worth a lot. It's worth a lot because the beer store, look, the beer store is not without some benefits and virtues. It is a relatively efficient distribution model. There's just one store, one place where the trucks have to go to. So it's a very almost Soviet-style distribution system, which means low cost.
Well, let's be fair. There's not one store. There's
but
hundreds and thousands of outlets all over the place.
So there's 440 or so. So you have a single warehousing operation. So it's one operator, I should say, with 440 stores. So that means that their costs, their distribution costs, are quite low in this province compared to anywhere else in Canada. The prices are more or less the same. The beer store says they're cheaper. Other independent economists say it can be more expensive. But it's in the same rough ballpark. Low costs, similar plus or minus prices, big fat profit margins. So the gross margins are high.
So Clark thinks there is a value to that cheaper distribution system that the beer stores ought to
share.
Absolutely.
There's no question. And you'll hear the beer stores say, I mean, I wish they were here tonight, but they're not. But you'll hear the beer stores say,
you know why? Just for the record, you know why?
Well, tell me.
Turned us down.
Okay, so you would think...
We offered, they declined. That's okay.
You would think that the beer store, being this big supplier that's delegated by the government, would be prepared to defend itself or explain itself to your audience, but they're not. So the beer store has this low-cost operation. That gives them a big gross margin. No one else has it. Ed Clark says, hey, if you don't want to... there's a franchise fee that you should pay for the privilege of running it. If you think there's nothing there, then give it up, give it back to us. And you'll hear the beer stores say, we're just a break-even operation. They put that in their ads and so on, as if they're the food bank or something. But they do make a profit, and Ed Clark has made it clear, has put it in his report, that the taxpayers of Ontario should share in that profit from the beer store.
Has anybody put a price tag on what they think that's worth and what percentage the tax-paying public should enjoy from it?
So no one has identified the total amount. I think it's in the tens of millions of dollars from the beer store itself. In terms of what they do is at the end of the year, they reconcile their operations. They're up a few $1 million, a few tens of millions of dollars. They rebate to themselves some of their distribution fees. So that's how they end up with zero. In addition, though, the brewers, the owners, have these high gross margins thanks to the beer store, which they have nowhere else in Canada. That's why they come out ahead. The government has said, unofficially, they've never said anything on the record, and they're in negotiations now with the brewers. But my sources tell me that they're looking in the tens of millions of dollars, somewhere as much as $100 million in what they would see as a franchise fee. It might not be that high, but it's not pocket change.
Let's play some tape here. Here's the beer store president, Ted Moroz, talking about why they opted to open up ownership of that franchise. Roll tape, please.
Well, this is much more than that. So, you know, the way we see it, we've been listening to what the consumers have had to say. We're listening to what brewers have had to say. We're definitely respectful of what we've been reading and hearing out there and what people are saying. And so, you know, we feel that these changes are great for the beer consumer and great for selection at the beer store.
You've been following this for a while. In your judgment, do they get any credit for the offer that they have put forward most recently?
Marginal. I think the craft brewers have been trying for a long time to have a dialogue with the big brewers, and they got nowhere. They feel at this particular juncture, it's just a publicity stunt to be coming out with this last-minute Hail Mary pass when it's already in the government's hands. They have this commission, this panel. The government is going to make its announcement in the budget in the spring. Why would the craft brewers play ball at the 11th hour when they have some momentum and they have the government's ear? So I don't think it's being taken seriously, and also the fact that they would only have 3 out of 12 seats on the board. It would be just for show.
You mean 3 out of 15 seats on the board?
Right, 3 out of 15.
So we are into the realm of politics here. You think the craft brewers are playing hardball because they think they can get a better deal waiting as opposed to going for this offer?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it hardball as much as I think they can see a fairly transparent publicity stunt by the beer store to co-opt them, to use them as political camouflage. I mean, if you look at some of the ads that the beer store bought in the wake of their announcement, and God bless them for buying some ads in the Toronto Star. They were boycotting us briefly in December. They came out with a poll, a public opinion poll that they released in those big full-page ads, saying that roughly 4 out of 5 Ontarians approved of this proposal. 4 out of 5 Ontarians, plus or minus, thought that it was a good thing for the beer store to open up. 4 out of 5 thought the beer store was doing a good job. This poll was taken at 6 p.m. on the Wednesday of the announcement, which was on the Canada Newswire, a press release, at 7:30 or so a.m. in that morning.
So it's
by
a poll
polling
based
standards,
on
that's a pretty rapid turnaround to ask people what they think about a fairly complicated issue same day.
Okay, but having said that, I think the beer store people have said over the years that they have made in their view, good faith efforts to open up the process and allow more brewers, not of the big three, to get their wares on their shelves. Are they being accurate when they say that?
It's very complicated. Retailing is complicated even in the supermarkets. The system in the beer store is not designed to keep the craft beers out. What it is designed to do, I would say, from talking to a number of former beer store employees at senior levels who have confided in me how this operates, and Ed Clark notes this in his report as well, is that the big brewers use their ownership position to give themselves the best display. So there's a reason that the beer store, in most of its outlets, or many of them outside of the cities and in the downtown core that have not yet been renovated, there's a reason that they are not a great browsing experience. They're not encouraging people to browse. They want them to have to think of the beer, the brand, off the top of their head based on big national advertising. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle that basically gives prominence to the big national brands owned by the big three brewers, with the craft beer brands out and back, and you have to ask for them by name, you have to find them, and it's more like going to the public library.
So it's not like the LCBO, which actually is a pretty good browsing experience.
Correct. It's a retail experience where you are encouraged to ask the staff and to get things and to explore, which you can't do at the beer store, which is one of the things that beer aficionados find so frustrating.
You revealed a so-called sweetheart deal between the LCBO and the Brewers Retail, as we used to call it, the beer store. Let's play the beer store president's clip related to that, then we'll come back and chat. Roll this, please, Sheldon.
At the beer store, we actually don't set prices. So we are really happy that we have the great selection that we do. We have over 100 brewers. We've got over 450 brands at the beer store. They all set their own prices. So they're competing with each other. They tell us what their prices are going to be. We sell them. We don't set the prices.
He seems to be suggesting there is no sweetheart deal. They don't set the prices. They just sell the stuff.
So the beer store likes to focus on the price issue. That's not what most of the objections come from. Of course, people would like cheaper beer, but let's be honest, most of the price does go to government taxes, and that's not going to change overnight, no matter what the reforms. What the beer store does is impose its own retail monopoly, quasi-monopoly on retail sales. For example, you cannot buy a 2-4 at the beer store, at the LCBO, I should say. Mm-hmm. You cannot buy a 12-pack currently at the LCBO because the beer store has this secret deal that was signed in roughly mid-2000 under a conservative government of the day that mandates the territory for the LCBO in much of Ontario, in rural Ontario and semi-rural, smaller population centers, and says that the beer store will have exclusive right to sell 2-4s, which is how most of the volume is transacted in Ontario. Most of the beer sales are with 2-4s, where you get a significantly more economical price on a 2-4 than you do with 4 6-packs. It's crazy. There's no good reason not to have the government-owned quasi-monopoly, the LCBO, selling and instead giving way to a private monopoly.
A couple of minutes left. Let's put one more issue on the table. They always say follow the money, so we're going to do that here. How much money did the Brewers give to the Liberal Party of Ontario over the past year?
I don't know over the past year. What I did is I've tallied up off the top of my head. It's about $380,000 went to all three parties over the last 2 years. So most of that went to the Liberal Party. A significant amount went, I think, in the tens of thousands. I'm thinking from memory about 50 or 60, 70,000 to the NDP, about 110,000 or so to the Tories, the Progressive Conservatives. That's not the biggest sum of money ever in this planet compared to American politics. But it's a large amount of money, and there's also these private fundraisers that the beer store facilitates for politicians at their 2 private salons, Molson and Labatt, in Toronto, where you can have beer on the house and the facility donated by the brewery for your political fundraising.
Question is, what do you get for that?
What does the beer store get in exchange?
Yes.
What's the quid pro quo?
If there is one.
That's the unanswered question. What I do think you have is an open door, no question. Their phone calls are returned. You also have a lot of staff that used to work in the Liberal government and even before that in the Conservative government that works for the big brewers as consultants or staffers. And so look, it's a pretty cozy deal, no question about it.
Ask the Premier of Ontario what that money gets and she says nothing. They just want to participate in democracy and that's how they do it. You buying?
That's what she says. I think she's always had a blind spot about Ontario's political fundraising. She's always defended it. I don't understand why. You know, in Ottawa, in Stephen Harper's Ottawa, companies and unions cannot donate. And I think he's got it right, and we've got it wrong in Ontario.
Gotcha. Martin, as always, thanks for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.